Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for inviting me to talk at this conference. In fact, when I saw the program, I thought maybe you should have sent it to an invitation to all my members of my institute, because I think they could learn so much. We could also learn so much. But I have been asked, as you know, to talk about the UK planning system. And when I was asked to do this, I said that, in fact, I thought it was important for people to understand what I call the sporting context of the UK planning system, its planning teams, the governing body, the planning players, the planning game itself having changed, and the way it's been used as a political football. The first thing in terms of the team, you have to recognise, although we call ourselves United Kingdom, like most things in the British system, we are different to what we call ourselves. We are not a United Kingdom, we are a divided nation. So even in terms of sport, we don't have just one team. It depends on which sport you're playing as to which countries align themselves and join themselves together. And that's very much the same for planning, because we actually have in effect 6 planning systems in the country. We have a Scottish one, which is the most advanced of them, in the sense of they are most separate from from any others. And in fact, they are if I go back a second, sorry, on that one, the Welsh system is one which actually is very much different from there's something going on my screen. Let me just try and fix it, please. I have to get rid of part of this. Let me just escape that. I have to restart sharing screen, sorry.
No problem.
That's better. And other things are getting in the way. So if in fact you can see that now better, there are actually a range of planning systems. The Welsh one has devolved powers, far less than the Scottish. The Northern Irish is devolved, but sometimes it's taken over by London. Greater London itself has is the only elected regional assembly in the UK, and has a different planning system. The Channel Islands and the Isle of Man are not even part of the United Kingdom, and England itself, which is the main part, is actually run by central government. And each therefore have very different planning legislations and systems under which they're operating.
Excuse me, Vincent. Could you make it full screen so it would be more legible for the audience?
I will do. Yeah. Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
Governing body. In all that respect, though, the UK Parliament is still the most dominant element. All power in all those areas are still ones that can be taken back to central government. So that's the context of government, and that's quite critical, because although planning is done at the local level, like in most countries, in terms of granting and refusing consents on the development of land, central government actually controls things. It has the capacity to scrutinize all decisions, to call them in, to overturn them. It can set performance targets. So at one stage it set targets for how much land the density of housing should be. And it also sets, as in fact you have in Italy, policies which actually then become binding on the local councils as to where they do their local plans, their zoning plans. So it's very, behind the background, there's this central control. The second thing is to be aware of the thing that dominates actually the way decisions are taken, and I think it reflects the way Bologna you were saying is moving, because there is an inherent tension between communities and developers in the UK. That's partly because of the scales of development, and we're talking about over the next 20 years of having between 4 and 8 million more a population to have to cope with. And in the middle, the equivalent of the HU, the RTPI, has to actually intervene, and its members, in terms of their advice and decision making, have to control it. The nature of those conflicts is often expressed as between NIMBYism, the not in my backyard, and those who want freedom from everyone else, but want control of other people, so control others, not us. And that's often expressed as local communities, in the case or example I show, of trying to oppose shopping development, and people like Walmart or their competitors saying, no, we should be able to build stores where we want. And that and planning and the planning systems at the heart of those conflicts. But that conflict is often reversed, and where in fact some of the major oppositions to development come from developers themselves. I have personally been taken in my plans to the Supreme Court by a major developer who did not like me promoting development which might be a competitor. So they were using the planning system to constrain competition where they had an established market. Similarly, you have people on an individual basis who actually claim to be in favor of environmental development and environmental standards in green transport, but actually opposing the introduction of cycleways, in the example I'm showing here. So it's actually not right to characterize this conflict of pressures between business and the community, but actually recognize it depends on what their vested interest is in. The fourth issue that you have to understand about the British planning system is that actually it has changed, and it's changed dramatically over the years. It started way back in terms of thinking back in 1813 with the new Lanark, and the promotion of in effect was at the time would have been considered a new town to challenge the oppressive nature of urban development and industrialization that we had in the UK. And as you all know, the work of Ebenezer Howard on promoting new towns was again a challenge to the way urban development was going. And both were actually at the heart of them concerned about the poverty within which people lived and died, and often died far too young. So we have a pattern where our planning system has evolved from a 19th century one of visionaries building new towns, to introduction of health acts, to the Garden City movement, to join the 20th century, to housing acts, which were in effect planning acts because they control development, to ones that stopped urban sprawl, like the Green Belt policies that were introduced, to then the renewal of cities after the war. And in the last 20 years or so, what has become paramount as the things that's driving the nature of our planning system is how to cope with the scale of urbanization that's going on, and the fact that we have a shortfall each year in terms of the government targets of about 100,000 houses being built, and therefore we're having great pressure upon housing prices, and on land which is available anywhere. And then we have the agenda of a sustainability and the need to accord with the types of policies that we've been just heard in Italy about soil sealing and water quality. But more recently is how do we accommodate the zero carbon agenda in a way that's just, that doesn't just serve the interests of industry, but also affects those most affected. And that fundamentally affects the way we have gone about planning. The last thing that happens is that planning has become a political football in this country, depending on where you are. So over the years, we've actually had legislation which has changed. Our primary acts were in 1947, and then every so often there was a period of deregulation. So the deregulation between 51 and 64. There then were new acts that came into a new planning act in the 67 and 68, which was concerned with the urban agenda, the urban amenity. But then there was deregulation again between 79 and 97, and then new planning acts which sought to strengthen local planning in 2004. And since 2012, there has been deregulation. So at any one time, status of planning has varied. It's gone up in the early 60s, it then came down during the 80s, it's shot up again in the early 2000s, but now it's on the decline. And so in a sense, if I were to tell you about the planning system as it is today and come back next year, you'll find that it has changed. And that even from today's papers, in the middle of all the COVID pandemic and all the major global issues that face, the headline issues this week have been about planning and the need to change the planning rules according to the government to deregulate further. And so we have headlines where they're saying demolition of planning rules will hand power to number 10, hand power to central government. And on the other hand, in the Times, which was one of our leading papers, the headline was that there were a risk of 400,000 new homes being built on countryside that should be protected. It is a major political issue at the moment. The government is seeking to deregulate greatly the planning powers, and so the planning system will change. So what I thought I'd just touch on was, in fact, some broader aspects of how the planning system operates in the UK, which actually remain fundamental. First of all, it consists of two components: the need to prepare a plan, the vision, setting up policies and very clear goals, which currently the zero carbon agenda is the most dominant one. And then we have a means of enforcing that through planning consents, in which people can either appeal against a refusal of planning consent, or councils can enforce people who do not comply with them. So those are basic and they're always there. The second one is that hierarchy that's been touched on already, between local bodies preparing plan, government actually through a whole range of initiatives being able to control it, and then ultimately going to the courts, which is why I was taken to the Supreme Court on my plan that I had to produce, and fortunately won the case, but it was very expensive and actually very long-winded and delayed development. So local bodies consist of local authorities, national parks, urban development corporations, and a range of local bodies who have powers. The government is through the Secretary of State, but also he has an agency called the Planning Inspectorate, PINS, who actually are the ones that you appeal to. And then he has agencies like the Highways Agency, the Environment Agency, who also have to be consulted. Then there's a question of what takes priority. What's actually been touched on, it seems to be, as a common theme. We have that hierarchy of plans. So we have the national level, we have a national planning framework that everyone has to comply with. We have in one area of London a strategic plan which governs what the boroughs have to do, the municipalities have to do. Elsewhere, there are local plans, as in my own area, West Oxfordshire, which are set out the zoning system as you would understand it. Then you also have a statutory neighbourhood plan for the village I live in, which is actually also has effect on whether a planning consent can be issued or not. And then below that, there are detailed policies. In this case, I'm giving the example from my own area of how much developers should contribute towards local services if they build houses. So it's a question of which takes priority in all this. The third one is actually to understand that in the British planning system, we have a fundamental different approach to many places. Planning decisions are discretionary. Every planning application has to be determined in its own right, and that means that plans are not binding. A local council or municipality can approve something contrary to the plan. It has, though, to take account of any factor and explain why it ignores the plan, but it can override them. And that could be for a whole range of reasons, in terms, for example, it is going to create a lot of jobs. So in doing that and in making a decision to override the plan, a council has to be rational, have a good reason. But the other key thing is that if someone does something contrary to the plan, it is not criminal. It's unlawful, but not criminal, because people always have the right to say, but they should have been given planning consent even though it was contrary to the plan. It's based on the fact that we have a tradition of common law in this country rather than Napoleonic law. The other thing is that because every decision has to be made in its own right and everything judged, every application for development considered in its own right, we have to have evidence for decisions that are taken. And what's happening is that we're finding that you have to assess if you're applying for housing on land that is not zoned for housing, to show what the housing land assessment is. You have to show that it's, if you're being asked to have obligations, that it's viable. There are traffic impact assessments. You have to show retail impact assessments, misspelling, sorry. If in fact someone wants to build a shopping centre, environmental impact assessments or strategic environmental assessments, design and access. So the whole range of reports, and that what I'm showing is just the thickness of reports that are produced just for one application for 90 houses. And it becomes very bureaucratic, very heavy. And then underlying all that, there is the protection of rights, both of landowners and individuals in the community. Landowners have to be consulted by anyone who wants to build it. They have to be compensated if, in fact, the council want to promote something which is contrary to the interests of the developer, and they have the right of appeal to the courts. Similarly, individuals and the community have the right to be consulted on applications. They also have a right to expect a sharing in the uplift in land value, what we call betterment, to fund, for instance, libraries, schools, or other things. But they have limited third-party rights. Their rights are on the plan, but not on planning applications. They are informed on planning applications, but they don't have a right of appeal. They can only have a right of representation. So what are the issues that underline the UK planning system in that context? Well, one is that it's everyone talks about simplifying the planning system. That's what the government says, but all it's introducing is increasing complexity. And if you take those 5 issues I've raised in terms of the hierarchy of plans, there are inherent tensions. First of all, despite the pressure and the rhetoric of government policy that they are involving the community, government policy still rules. This desire for evidence on all decisions means that we have information overload, which is just beyond the ability of most people to cope with. We are also finding that planning is becoming far too litigious. For 20 years, I was involved in preparing plans in which during that whole 20 years, there was only one legal challenge to the plan. In the last 5 years, when I was a chief officer that I had responsibility for preparing a plan, I had 5 legal challenges. The rate of litigation has accelerated. And if plans are to be discretionary, who has that choice? How do you stop it being a source of corruption? And finally, there is this endemic conflict between the interests of the landowner on the one hand and the community. And then the question, therefore, the planning system really depends and its effectiveness on the independence of the inspectorate, those people to whom appeals are made, to determine whether, in fact, justice has been served. What has emerged, and what is that a strong thing, feeling I have in the whole system, is that as a general issue in the country, our planning systems are not working effectively. And if you look back over the history, the real progress in planning has not come from the statutory system, from the legal formal system. It's been by independent planners thinking and preparing strategies, whether that was way back when Robert Owen promoted and wrote about the need for new settlements like New Lanark, or when Ebenezer Howard came forward with his ideas for Newtown, or in our current period where a group of us in the UK are actually saying we need to come together, and we formed a Common Futures Network to say we need to set out our ideas about the way the country's going, which are irrespective of the statutory system, and we need a new agenda. And there is a move of saying we as planners have to we have to stand up and put our own views on the table, whatever the planning system delivers, because the planning system is not delivering what it needs to. And that leads me to a final thought, which is basically that if we take the simple concept that actually underlines good design across any form of design framework, is that form should follow function. Therefore, the form of planning system should follow function. It should be in the interest of the community and not vested interest. And it should be in the interest of future generations. So I'll leave you with that thought, that actually we need to think about who we're planning for, why we're planning, as the basis for determining what the system should be. Thank you very much.